about ready to start, apparently, so we will begin. I want to thank the crew here, Mike Bush's crew, for taping this event for us. This is a colloquium like many that we have, but unlike many in that this is a special colloquium. This is the Humanities Across the University series that we have. In fact, you're the second speaker in the series. We had Steve Peck last year as part of our symposium give the first one of these presentations to us, someone from across campus whose interests intersect in provocative ways with our own. As you'll hear in a minute, Nathan's got a reason why he's interested in the humanities. Let me introduce our speaker to you today. Well, first, I guess more generally, the purpose for this is to host a meeting in which we have a chance to hear about someone's work during part of campus that bears in some provocative ways that we could anticipate and not anticipate on our own work and thinking. These kinds of conversations are fruitful, I think, for all parties concerned, and they can help us to make friends across the campus. They can help us extend our influence into our project, give us new ideas for our own thinking. I think it's great. I want to thank Nathan for being here today. It's really great you're doing this. He's very, very busy. In fact, I'll give the introduction to Nathan right now. Nathan Furr is Assistant Professor of Entrepreneurship in, the Department of Business Management until like tomorrow or something. Yeah. At which point he moves to the Department of Organizational Leadership and Strategy here at BYU. He has a number of publications that are really strong. Let me go backwards a bit. Nathan is a graduate of this college. He got his bachelor's and master's in English at BYU. You bachelor's in 2000 and master's in?
Bachelor's in 98, master's in 2000.
Okay. And then went on to get an MBA at BYU and went to get a PhD at Stanford, where he finished his PhD in strategy, entrepreneurship, and organizations in 2009. And he's been a professor here in the Marriott School ever since that time. He's got a number of really interesting publications and things which he's currently working. He has a book coming out from Harvard Business School Press next year called The Innovator's Method, subtitled How Corporations Can Apply the New Management Science of Innovation. He's the author of a book called Nail It Then Scale It, which I've heard praised by those who work in the business school here on campus. He's got a couple of emergent projects, which one of them that sounds descriptive is Entrepreneurial Logics and the Emergence of Capability, subtitled Inductive Cross-Case Project of Capability, Emergence in Early Stage Ventures. Here's one I like. Death Still Hurts. It's like, really? So anyway, how would he know? I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway, he's got work that is, I think, really provocative. And I've had a chance to talk to Nathan a bit, and he's got a really great mind for ideas and concepts. So I'll turn it over to Nathan right now. Thank you for being here. Please welcome Nathan Furr.
So thank you for having me back in many ways. And, I may look dressed down. And I remember when I made the switch to do something in business, I was so worried about what Thoreau said, always be aware of any enterprise that requires new clothes, So I'm going to have to adopt new clothes. Is there something fundamentally wrong? And maybe in some ways, there was a deeper core thread that you just can't break because I'm back to wearing the clothes that I used to wear. And this is kind of a standard uniform for, the innovation crew. It's like you got to dress down in innovation because if you're dressed up, it's like, do we trust what he's saying? So, I really hope to make this as interactive as possible, but I'll probably make the mistake most professors make of talking too much. Get a professor going, they never stop. But before I start, I actually want to do something, and that is I want to pass around these cards and pens. And what I'd like to do is, and I hate to be, just, make sure I know what your name is. And what I'd like you to do is capture three things. I'll write it down, tell you first. First, if I say something or I'm talking about a topic and a light bulb goes on and says, hey, there's a connection there. I know of something that guy should read that's outside of his field. That's what I'd really love, because if any of the top three things I love in the world, learning is definitely one of those top three. I probably shouldn't say it's number one, because definitely like my family's number one. But I love to learn, and most of the big insights in our field have come from borrowing ideas from other fields. So what I want is that the three things you would put on a row is, in one or two words, what did you hear? What was the topic? You know, what did you hear? And then I would say the second part is, what should I look at? You know, maybe it's a book, maybe it's an article, maybe it's a title, I don't know. And then in one word or two, if you want, why. But you don't have to do the why. What I really want is, hey, I heard you talking about hybrids, or I heard you talking about uncertainty, and you should read this book by this person, or you should talk to me, you know, whatever the case may be, because I want to learn as much as I can from this experience and your time here. So just to introduce myself a little bit, let's see, he needs power. Yeah, no worries. You know, so I did graduate from BYU in English, undergraduate and master's degree. I guess to provide you a little insight into my trajectory, I love literature and I love reading and I love the perspective the humanities gives a person. I was full on set to become an English professor like many of you. There was a point where I kind of hit, I think it was new historicism, where it was like, and I hope I'm not offending anybody, but it became like almost like this circular logic for me, which is, you know, there's a power structure in the literature, and I'm going to critique the power structure that's in the critique of the literature. And, you know, by the way, in this critique, you are installing a new power structure. And it just made me think, I said, oh gosh, I love this. I love this field, but you guys make a ton of sacrifices to do what you love, and I admire that. And I just said, you know, before I make that sacrifice, I'm going to ask myself, is there anything else I love? And I thought, you know, I used to say never business. Business are those sales guys, you know. They're knocking on doors selling pest control. That's the last thing in the world I would ever want to do. But I started just saying, you know, I should at least search. And I started looking around. I started getting interested in different things. And I kind of went over to the Marriott School and said, well, you know, I'm an English major. I don't think I have any skills really. You know, maybe I should just get an MBA. And they said, you have tons of skills. I said, really, I have skills? Oh yeah, you have so many skills. You know how to think broadly. You know how to, you know, communicate and all these things and kind of generic things. And I thought, well, maybe it's true. And so I started to sniff around to try to get, you know, some jobs. I eventually made my way to working for in what we call management consulting, but for one of the top tier strategy firms. And what surprised me most is actually I did really well. And I did well because if you think about the process of, as a student at least, reading a text, you're looking at all these signals and cues in the text, and you're formulating theories as you go through it for the first time, and you're building evidence for that. And then you've got to communicate that. And that turned out to be immensely valuable in my cohort, because what would happen is, you know, if Matt and I are from the same field, but you came out of economics, and your supervisor, you know, your case team leader comes and says, oh, Matt, I've got a call with a client today. What is going on in the transformation of the internet and how it affects physicians? And you say, as an econ guy, I don't know, my analysis isn't done yet. And I say, well, you know, our analysis isn't complete, but there's kind of two theories. Here's the evidence for this theory, and here's the evidence for this theory. And the case team leader says, you know, Matt, you're a smart guy, but Nathan told me something I can actually use. And so anyway, I did that for a while. I did come back and do an MBA. I did my PhD at Stanford in the Technology Ventures program. What I do here at BYU is I teach creating new ventures. I teach an interdisciplinary innovation class, so this is a good place to spread the word. That is trying to pull together students from all over the university and faculty from different disciplines to create a year-long innovation experience that, with the goal of not creating new companies, but creating a trajectory shift, a career trajectory shift, a mind shift, a perspective shift in how students think about other disciplines and how they think about innovation. It's modeled on a course I taught at Stanford, and you know, we did the same thing there. We incubated students, helped them learn a new way of thinking, and then saw what happened. And some of our successes, a lot of you probably use Instagram. Those guys were actually my students. Asana, which is a task management software. Maybe if you're a real rebel, you've heard of Bitcoin, which is this alternate currency. So students created that. So that's kind of what I do here. What I want to hit on is my two areas of research, and just kind of tell you some stories and see how you can borrow the specific framework or the framework maybe at a higher level of abstraction. So like I'll talk about the idea of disruptive technologies, how an old technology gets replaced by a new, and you might think, does this model apply to, we know there's some one author, Kuhn, wrote about how it applies to, scientific theories as well as to technologies. So that's kind of my goal, and then at the end I'll leave lots of room to discuss overlaps. So please, yeah. All right, so technology strategy, another one, sorry, this is so I have two big areas of research, tech strategy innovation, and then where I'm really passionate about lately, which is managing uncertainty. So next slide. There we go. So we describe the evolution of technologies at a very high level with this kind of famous S-curve, with time on the horizontal axis, performance on the vertical axis. The idea that early in the life of technologies, they tend to not be very good, and then they improve at a rapid rate, and then they mature and become, the rate of growth and improvement slows. And when that rate of growth and improvement slows, they tend to become most vulnerable for disruption and displacement. So, next slide. And no worries, it's probably because you're on the middle of the keypad. And so one of our core ideas, at least what I research, is this idea of disruptive technologies. This is a pattern that affects all of our lives every year, the pattern by which an old technology gets displaced by a new. And what makes this pattern interesting is not that it happens, but how it happens. So this here is a mechanical watch. Again, I'll resort to stories here. In 1970, mechanical watches were pretty much the only watch you could buy. And the Swiss dominated this industry. There was an industry cluster in Jura, Switzerland. They produced 40% of the watches in the world. They were really good at making these little mechanical parts with immense precision, making the casings, and then distributing them through a global network of jewelers. That was it. And then in 1971, you see this first digital watch. Look, little old Swiss watchmakers, no hands. I kind of love the description. Strap a computer with flashing lights on your wrist. It's kind of funny. So next one, just one click. Yeah, this is what it looked like. Now, when this threatening technology first emerged, actually one more click, I'll show you. It cost $1,500 too. Now, compared to, I should say, when this technology first emerged, the Swiss did what we call them incumbent, the existing technology in firms. What every incumbent usually tends to do, they invest a little bit of money right at the beginning to understand the technology, and they conclude, it stinks, it's no good. I mean, look at this. Look how ugly that is compared to the beauty of a Swiss watch. And it's $1,500. And, compared to our capabilities at making these beautiful components and these beautiful watches, and, even when they go ask their customers, they say to their customers, for example, the jewelers, do you want to sell that? And they say, oh, no, that's cheap junk. We don't want to sell that. And they go to the people buying Swiss watches and they say, do you want to buy that digital watch? And like, no, that's cheap junk. We don't want that. Then the technology improves bit by bit. In 1971, this digital watch was $1,500. In 1974, digital watches cost $2. And when they cost $2, the jewelers still did not want to sell them. They were junk. But guess what? There were a lot of people that wanted a $2 watch compared to the alternative of no watch because they couldn't afford a Swiss watch. So it took hold among non-users. And then what happens is the technology got better and better over time. It started to look better, perform better, and soon it got good enough that, the kind of low end of Swiss watch customers started to adopt it. And, at the time, the Swiss were like, we didn't really care about those customers anyway. They were the low-margin customers. But then the technology gets better, and eventually it's good enough that it decimated the Swiss watch industry. And by 1980, 10 years later, they have less than 10% of the global market. And the only Swiss mechanical watches we see around today are the high-end ones. Those really I don't know, if you read The Economist, they have these cheesy ads like, you don't buy a Patek Philippe, you save it for the next generation. I'm just like, oh, it's so arrogant, you know. I mean, my watch, I don't wear a watch because it just gets destroyed. Okay, so next slide. So this is the general pattern that we observe in disruptive innovation. Clay Christensen, you know, an LDS scholar at Harvard, kind of first said this clearly. You have time here on this axis, performance on this axis. He says, why does this pattern occur where the Swiss just don't see it coming, or it's the mini computer makers, or it's the CD makers, or, you know, go on, every technology that, you know, that disrupts an old, we tend to see this pattern. What happens is there's a pace of technical progress. Okay, next one. And, you know, it's interesting. This is, let's just click through them all because it's missing a little piece here. Sorry. Okay, well, there's a little line. There's supposed to be a little line here, guys. Sorry. There's a little red line. I would draw it on here, but then you remember me forever. And that is the performance that a customer can absorb, the average customer. And as a technology gets better, it exceeds this red line. So that it has more capacity than you can absorb. Think about like Microsoft Word or Microsoft Excel, or think about the computers in your offices. They have a lot more capacity than most of you probably use, and certainly most of your students can use. And the point here is if we look at the Swiss watch industry, it got better than people really needed it to be. And as people chase this pace of technical progress, they tend to chase the high end of the market where they can make the most money. So if we think of computers, for example, you make the most money selling a really fancy computer with all the newest parts, not the kind of, you know, $800 bargain computer. You know, you make like $50 on that. So existing companies have this incentive to go really high end up here. But when a new disruptive technology comes in, it's below this red line, imaginary red line, of what customers can absorb. It's not good enough. It's like the digital watch. It stinks. You know, when personal computers first came out, what did people say? They're toys for kids. You know? And so it usually takes hold among non-users and then improves over time to the point where it meets the needs of most customers. And at that point, it disrupts the old technology. And usually, incumbents have a hard time, the existing firms have a hard time surviving this. Now, I'm just kind of telling you the general pattern here. There's lots of reasons we've determined why incumbents have a hard time responding. Excuse me, a lot of times it's that they have a set of processes, or it's how they view the world, or they have a set of resources, or complementary assets like factories, or commitments, or how they understand the customers that lock them into viewing the old technology and saying, you know what, we'll never be displaced. So, for example, in the switch from bias tires to radial tires, you know, the tire companies say, you know, we've got these big factories in like Georgia, and, you know, we've promised that we'd employ people, and, you know, these new tires aren't going to really take over anyway, and, you know, we're so good at making these tires, and we've got these big factory lines installed with the tires, and they just are very slow to see, oops, the new technology has disrupted us. And this is a pattern that applies to lots of things beyond technology. It could apply to theoretical paradigms. For example, when a new theoretical idea comes out, it's often seen as kind of not good enough, kind of hokey. Like, what are those guys really thinking? And then over time, as it starts to attract sometimes non-users, maybe people who aren't in the most prestigious institutions in the field, but people who start to say, yeah, you know, that makes a lot of sense to me. And then maybe it marches up over time and becomes more of a mainstream theory. Sometimes it can come from the top, you know, like the Tesla Roadster, which is the all-electronic, sports car, that maybe is introducing an electronic car future. I'll talk about that in a second. So my research is kind of saying, okay, when this change happens, how do firms survive it? And what do they do in response to these things? One paper I have is looking at what's called the last gasp. So I said this S-curve is this familiar pattern. Well, a lot of times when technologies are threatened, suddenly, even though this is supposedly a mature, exhausted technology, you see a sudden burst in performance that threatens to delay or even defeat the new technology. Classic examples of this are like when sailing ships were first threatened by steam. I mean, sailing ships have been around forever. And yet suddenly they have this burst of innovation and the performance of sailing improves and, you know, at least delays the transition to steam sailing. Same thing when Edison invented the light bulb, right? So gas lighting was the dominant technology. Electric lighting is the new technology. What happened when, you know, the gas lighting firms saw the emergence of electric lighting? They fought it. And they did some fun things to delay that transition. Maybe next slide. Go ahead and click. Let's see. So gas lighting, okay, another one. Intel's a great example of this. You know, for decades, people have been saying that the, you know, silicon semiconductors should be replaced by other materials or other solutions. Yet somehow, they keep breaking the fundamental laws of science and rapidly, you know, increasing the performance of the semiconductor chips in your computers, and it remains the dominant technology. So I actually looked at this in the carburetor industry. So this is a carburetor. It delivers fuel to the engine of your car, or used to. Notice how mechanical it is. Next one. It was replaced by electronic fuel injection. Notice how electronic that is. So that was an example of a technology transition. And we looked at this and we said, how is it that these firms survived and what effect did their efforts have? And we show that there's a big last gasp that delays the technology transition. And one of the ways they survive is actually my second paper, which is this idea of a hybrid. So in the past, people tended to look backwards at technology and say, they would see this kind of weird occurrence. And that would be where a firm would take the old technology and the new technology and recombine them. And looking backwards, it looks really funny and clumsy and like a manifestation of that organizational inertia I was talking about earlier. But it tends to forget the history of these transitions. I told you the Swiss watch transition, that happened in 10 years. That's actually remarkably fast. Personal computers took a long time. Electronic cars, it's currently taking a long time. We don't know. In fact, I love the electronic car example because think about it. Are electronic cars the future? I don't know. A lot of things need to happen. Could electronic cars totally disrupt internal combustion engines? They could. Will it happen? I don't know. So if you're a car maker, what do? You know, we know from this disruptive story I told you that usually people say, well, this will never happen to me. And so they sit and wait until it's too late. I also said sometimes they jump too early, like the Swiss watch manufacturers who get in, take a taste and say, ooh, this is no good. So you see that today, right? You see like the Chevy Volt. Gosh, that is just way too early. I'm not surprised that it was a failure, that it's not selling well. The technology transition isn't quite ready to happen. Think about all the parts that need to come into play to effectively make a transition happen. You're going to need charging stations. You're going to need battery production. You're going to need customers to kind of switch gears in their brains and say, you know, electronic car could be great, and you know, it wouldn't be that expensive to get somewhere I could plug it in at home. You know, all these kind of things need to happen. So what we did in our papers, we kind of tried to reframe this idea of what a hybrid is. And we said, you know, hybrids are a learning strategy. They're a way to learn about the future today. So if you think about the Toyota Prius, it's kind of halfway between that electronic future and the internal combustion engine of today, right? It steals some components from the future, and what we argue is by producing this hybrid, Toyota is able to prepare for that future. So imagine two scenarios. One is electronic cars take over the world. Well, if that's true, then Toyota will have learned a lot more about how to design, source, build, market, distribute electronic-based vehicles than competitors who didn't do anything. If an electronic car future doesn't happen, then maybe Toyota steals a little piece from a future threat and makes their current technologies better and more competitive today. And I think that seems to be kind of playing out, you know. The Prius is the #1 selling hybrid and the #1 selling car in Japan. So #1 selling car in Japan, #1 selling hybrid. They're learning an immense amount about that electronic future. And if you wonder if that electronic future will happen, well, I continue to wonder, but I'm starting to get convinced. And one reason is I start to hear my students talking about buying the Tesla S. So Tesla is this electronic car company. You probably saw them. They were really flashy. They produced the Roadster, which was this $100,000 electric vehicle, you know. And then they produced the sedan. And as it turns out, that car is selling like mad, or at least selling more than they can produce. Of course, there are constraints, but you know, I teach a lot of different things. One thing I teach is this little MBA thing for UNC Chapel Hill. And I get some pretty conservative students there, you know, like it's kind of funny. You know, like, you know, really anti-Obamacare and the oil will rule the world forever. But some of them are buying these like Tesla S cars. I'm just like, no way, I can't believe it. Why are you buying this electronic car? And they're saying things like, well, my employer put in a free charging station at work, so basically I don't pay anything for fuel. And I'm like, okay, there you have it. If the skeptics can be converted. I mean, I still think, again, these transitions take years. But think about hybrids in other areas of life, or like, for example, the university. I mean, the university is potentially threatened by a different technology, this kind of massively online open courses. You know, is it going to happen? I don't know. One thing we do know for sure is incumbents always say it will never happen to me. And sometimes it doesn't happen. But what a hybrid does is it allows you to kind of experiment and begin to understand that whatever that new future could be. So I'm kind of a fan of experiment, thinking about what could that future be and what are the experiments we could run. So the innovation class I teach is an experiment on that future. It says, what if we can't just deliver, I can't just deliver a class anymore where I'm lecturing to you because somehow you could film me and catch me online. Well, what the interdisciplinary innovation class is, it's a deep, immersive experience. You're doing the things we talked about, and we're mentoring you in the process, and it's connecting you to the network of innovators that are around the area, and it's creating an experience that you could never replicate online. That's one way. Creating an online course, that's another way to experiment. I don't know, I don't have the answer for these things, but I'm just trying to say the idea of a hybrid has more general principles that could be applied. Okay, I'm talking too much. Last one, so my other big research area, which is what motivated this book I'm writing, is about this topic of managing uncertainty. And I'll tell you a story just to motivate this, and then I'll be quiet soon. So this very fancy, rich-looking gentleman on the left is Alfred Sloan. Anybody heard of Alfred Sloan? If you watch PBS, you probably did. It was sponsored by the Sloan Foundation. There's the Sloan School of Management. There's the Sloan this, Sloan that. Sloan was the manager who turned General Motors into the model corporation of its era. It's kind of seen as the father of the modern corporation. Very influential. Anybody heard of Billy Durant? I would be surprised if you had. But ironically, he was the entrepreneur who created General Motors. Now, when I say this to my audiences in engineering schools or business schools, they've heard of Alfred Sloan, but they've never heard of Billy Durant. And Alfred Sloan died rich and famous, and Billy Durant kind of died. He actually died managing a bowling alley in Michigan. It was because he was such a, you know what it was? He was a great entrepreneur, but a terrible manager. So he started as an entrepreneur in the horse and buggy industries, and he kind of would take the standard horse and buggy, and then he would do what would be the equivalent of today of options on a car. So he made millions just basically adding options on the horse and buggies. Saw cars coming, said we should do this, founded General Motors, built it up to be a very successful company. I mean, hundreds of millions in revenue in today's dollars. There's pictures of Durant in Flint, Michigan, with like thousands of people working at his plants behind him. Great entrepreneur, terrible manager. So the board of directors kicked him out of the company. He was so mad, he went and founded this other little no-name company called Chevrolet and built that up to be successful, repurchased control of General Motors again, was running it, but again, a great entrepreneur, but a terrible manager, and the board kicked him out a second time. That's when Alfred Sloan took over. That's when Alfred Sloan got all the credit and all the money. Now, Billy Durant did end up with a lot of wealth, but he didn't know how to manage it. So I like this story because it suggests to me that these two guys had something fundamentally different. This guy had something that allowed him to prosper in the big corporation. By the way, he went to MIT and earned his degree at MIT, which is part of why he went back and endowed it as the Sloan School of Management. This guy, he didn't go to a business school or anything like that. He had something different. And if we look back at the history of management, it's very interesting. Think about the Industrial Revolution. The first large corporation is in the 1600s, the Dutch East India Company. Industrial Revolution starts to kick off in the 1700s. By 1850, the entire landscape of life as we know it has changed due to technology. Before the Industrial Revolution, every organization was a small organization. Every business was 30 people or less, what we would call a small business. By 1850, the landscape is full of big, huge companies that make steel and oil and railroads and all this kind of stuff. And it created a new profession called management. In fact, by 1850, the president of Harvard College said, half our graduates are going to this new profession called management. Yet there was not a single business school in existence at that time. In fact, it wasn't until the 1880s that we get Wharton, which is the first business school attached to the University of Pennsylvania. And not even until 1908 when we get the first MBA at Harvard. And what my argument is that, business education was created to fill the ranks of this profession called management. And management deals with a problem. And that is a problem of how do we execute? How do we extract the value out of the customers we have? How do we make the trains run on time? How do we shovel more iron? How do we, compete in that process of making textiles and delivering airplanes and flying people around? That's an optimization and execution type of problem. But what Billy Durant did was something really different, right? He created something new from nothing. He created customers is the word we might use. Of course, we don't create people. But what he did is discovered what problem do they have, what solution can I match to it, and how can I communicate that solution to them? And so my argument around this managing uncertainty is that most of what we know in management theory was developed for the problem of managing relative certainty. And in fact, we have done very little or been remiss to develop our theories around how do we manage uncertainty. And that has had a few consequences. Maybe if you don't mind, I'm going to skip through a few slides just because we, when I think about certainty versus uncertainty, known versus unknown, known problem management, as we tend to teach it over there across the street, would be things about how do we plan, how do we avoid errors, how do we maximize, how do we optimize, how do we execute? We're trying to, we know we need to make chairs and tables, and how do we do that better? Whereas unknown problem management is we don't know what we're doing. These are my students who created Instagram, or my students who created the Owlet baby monitor. They have an idea about what customers might want, but it's just a guess. And the world is full of uncertainty for them because they might be convinced they know what they're doing, but I can promise you, once they get out there and start talking to people, they'll realize that they don't know. And so the process to do that is much more something around experimenting, around satisficing instead of trying to optimize. Counterintuitively, we try to minimize what we do rather than maximize. Action over planning, accepting failure, kind of radical failure acceptance is really critical to this. I just interviewed a former student at Amazon.com, and he's like, what sets us apart from our competitors is we are totally okay with failing 3 or 4 times right away before we even start to figure out what's right. And we can dig into that more, but maybe if we, okay, next one. And we observe this first in startups and new companies, But now the argument I'm making in this book is it's not about the size of the company, it's about this nature of the problem, about how do we manage uncertainty. And I would argue, I talk about this idea of an innovation school in contrast to the business school. So the business school is about how do we manage certainty. An innovation school is the management science of uncertainty. And if we look across disciplines, I would propose that I see that many disciplines, as they've encountered increasing uncertainty in the environment around them, have developed their own answer to this. So for example, in engineering, there's this kind of paradigm around what they call design thinking. So the engineers were making products, and then they'd go try to launch them, and nobody cared. Nobody bought them. There's so many misfires, it was absurd. And design thinking said, gosh, maybe we should actually go watch people and see what they actually do and what their problems might actually be, and then maybe try to match the solution to that problem. And it sounds simple, but it's really about, underneath that is saying, it's uncertain what problems people face and what do they do and how do we solve it. Agile software. So computer science used to develop using a waterfall methodology. You write the specifications for what the software should be. You deliver the software, and then that's it. That's kind of the Obamacare website these days, which I wish it was doing better. But an agile software says no. It's about these short little loops to figure out what's wrong. Lean startup is what we call it in entrepreneurship. I also wrote the book Nail It Then Scale It. But we see this in the Army and adaptive military. We see this. I saw this in physics with action learning. And there's lots of, these are kind of little teeny pieces of the answer, but I don't think we have the whole answer yet. In fact, there are huge things we're missing, like what does it mean to be a team under uncertainty? What does a group mean under uncertainty? And one thing I can tell you is that the traditional model we borrow from management of a hierarchy or there's a leader and I'm in charge doesn't really work that well under uncertainty. So lots of questions to examine there. And just so you know, we're not totally ignorant. Connections to humanities here. We are always looking to borrow ideas. One of the ideas we've borrowed the most is biology. So looking at the idea of firms like populations of animals almost. And they live in a resource-rich or resource-poor zone. And how do they change over time? Possibilities of overlap with the humanities as I see it. There has been, 10 years ago, there's a little bit of talking about strategy as a narrative. It didn't really seem to take off a lot. But this, power, understanding the conversation of power seems like a potential to me. I think of, when I talk about uncertainty, I think of, I have to think of postmodernism and Derrida and this idea that, there could be multiple states of a thing, so I'm still wrestling with what uncertainty means. Next slide. There are chances to reframe our existing ideas and questions. So we have some very kind of rigid views of things. So one of our core questions is, why does a firm exist? And it's all about the boundaries of the firm and about efficiencies, and it just strikes me as wrong. What is management? What is it supposed to mean, and what does it mean under uncertainty? Is it something different? Next one. Sorry, next slide.
Is that it?
No, I think you're hitting the right-hand side of it. That's a really funky one. I always have a hard time with that. Okay, overlapping ideas, and I'm just going to skip to the last slide here. Just so you know, we do take these things seriously. This is a call for submissions in one of our top journals, which is History and Organization Studies. And, invitation for history to be taken seriously as part of a rapprochement with the humanities have not gone unheeded. It is generally accepted now that history matters. Partly this is due to I know it sounds ironic, but you get that really sanitized view of technology, you forget this. Partly this is due to the ascendancy of the theoretical perspectives that take history seriously, blah, 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 blah. But the idea is, how do we, for example, examine how concepts derive from history, such as ideal types or invented traditions, can be applied to the study of management or organizations. So there are people out there who are saying, by the way, Paul Godfrey is my good friend right here at BYU. So he's one of the editors on that. And I was talking to him about, this idea of I want to write this theory paper about the management of uncertainty. And he was saying, you should be going really broad if you want to make a contribution. You should be looking at quantum physics and thinking about how, matter can have two states. And what is that kind of idea? And he was saying you should be looking at hermeneutics. You should be looking at these different theories and saying, how do these things apply? So I've talked more than I intended to. Let me maybe be quiet and ask you what thoughts came to mind, what questions you have for me, or what things I should be reading.
Yes.
Yeah. Are you equating history with the humanities instead of the social sciences just because of the new historicism?
I'm not. I'm definitely not that naive. But what I'm saying is that when we say we want to take history seriously, so the management perspective is saying we tend not to look at history. Let me give you a perfect example. When we talk about the personal computer industry disrupting the microcomputer industry, we don't look at the fact that IBM produced hybrids of typewriters and personal computers, and maybe that actually had a role. Or we don't look at the complexity of what actually goes on. I mean, these things are a gargantuan mess once you start to dig into the history. We just talk about big patterns. And so I'm not trying to equate history with the humanities at all. But what I'm using this as an example of how management is saying we need to look beyond the boundaries of our discipline and say what ideas and theories could inform what we're doing that we've overlooked. And history is one example of that.
And so then where is the tie to humanities?
Well, what do you define as the humanities?
History is actually one good tie, I think. History, culture, language.
Yeah, I mean, would you exclude history from the humanities? To me, I mean, history is in the heart of humanities. Yeah. I mean, how do we study humanities without also understanding history? I mean, when we look back at texts over all periods of time, they tell us something about our history. I mean, you just can't separate the two from me. So I don't think, the history department because it's over on some other funky part of campus. I mean,
Can I ask a question, Nathan?
Yeah.
First of all, you're doing really, really interesting work, and I love the fact that you're kind of working with sort of questions of uncertainty, which I find really interesting. You began by talking about sort of power relationships, that you sort of learned about as an undergraduate and master's student. And you wound up talking about power relationships. And the question was about this idea of disruptive innovation.
Yeah.
Now, on the one hand, that's been such a major idea in the business world.
Yeah.
You don't read about it in the humanities, but it would be interesting as an experiment to sort of say that new historicism, for example, was kind of a disruptive innovation to the larger sort of established form called deconstruction.
Yeah.
Right? It was easier, simpler, not as good, but easier to grasp. Eventually, there it goes. I mean, you could make it this kind of. Have you thought about ways in which, though, your humanities background has given you insights into that kind of a concept? Because you did understand these things about historicism or about other kinds of language theories, philosophical theories. Has that come into play very often, even in hybrid ways, in your own work?
Well, it's, and by the way, maybe I should have clarified. I'm not saying new historicism is the only theory that's relevant. I just use that as an example because,
It's a good example, actually.
There's two sides to what I study. One is an economic side, which is this very rational approach. One is the organization theory side, which tends to look at things like how do social structures get created, where do they come from, how do they influence our choices. So I think it's allowed me to much more deeply understand that side of the conversation. So I'm actually usually people tend to be one side or the other. Like I'm org theory or I'm an econ, but I don't ever combine both. So that has definitely helped me understand that. I wrestle continuously with how do I take what I learned in all those years and bring that to bear on these problems. And I think the reverse thing could be true because I think if we think about the patterns by which particular literary movements disrupt other literary movements, literary theories disrupt other theories, there's probably some lessons to be learned here, or at least patterns that could be applied. That even that S-curve analogy. Like a new literary movement has all this potential, but it's not well accepted. It's seen as not good enough, and then people start to see the value of it and people start to jump in, and it rapidly improves in its popularity and impact. And then at some point it kind of becomes mature and people think this is kind of played out, and then they disrupt it with a new theory or movement. Or they hybridize, so like I love like modern Japanese literature. Like, it's great, and I feel like when I read Haruki Murakami, I should wear this shirt, like I knew this band before he was popular, But what does he do? He's like he kind of does all these weird things to kind of hybridize like a kind of Raymond Carver mystery novel with like, kind of themes of contemporary Japanese isolation to kind of break the paradigm of existing Japanese literature. And, now people read him more popularly. And I have no idea what I'm talking about, by the way. I just do this for fun, so I'm just reading this for fun. So if you're all, modern Japanese literature, people and I offended you, like just chalk it up to an ignorant business guy. I don't know. I do not have the answer, but I want to figure it out because I think there's got to be huge things to happen there.
Actually, there are some things, interesting places of overlap here.
Yeah.
Really good.
Make sure you write them down. Yes, Ed, and then over here.
As Matt was asking the question, I was thinking about something I heard once in the 80s to early 90s, that the number of dissertations, doctoral dissertations in our field that were done with Bakhtin as sort of the figure, just they spiked almost, overnight, and then there was a high point, and then it just kind of crashed. And I guess that's sort of the question, if you think about innovation, it seems like there's a fine line between a genuine innovation and trend jumping.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm just curious how that works in the business side of things, because it seems to me that in order for the innovation to take, it still has to have some real roots somehow.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what Matt was talking about with the new historicism is, the new historicism really was very complex, but in the form that because it was trying to still reconcile itself to deconstruction.
Mm-hmm.
But when that dropped out, it just strikes me as became more of a catch term for race, class, gender studies that were more sociological, that really inflected by the original nuances of the new historicism. So in a similar way, I guess, how do you tell when you've got a real innovation on your hands rather than just a fad or a trend?
It's interesting. I was just thinking of this idea a little bit the other day. How it would be fun to write a book on this idea of windows of opportunity. And let me just kind of talk about that for a second, then maybe hopefully answer your question. So I described this S-curve, but if we dig in a little deeper, the way it usually works is at the emergence of a new innovative paradigm. There's what we call an era of ferment. There's lots of variants of that particular technology. So you think about the early auto industry, hundreds of types of autos. So different number of wheels, different ways to steer it, different, steam, electric, and internal combustion, and they're all kind of competing to become what we eventually call the dominant design. And there are a number of kind of social factors and economic factors that can shape what becomes the dominant design. As I hear you talk, I hear things hear you talking about things like the complexity of the idea versus the simplicity of the idea, the relationship of the new idea to the old idea. And then that dominant design kind of tends to take hold in technology, and then it starts to, and this is where I want to go with some of my work, is it starts to break up. It becomes a very homogenized dominant design, and then people's preferences kind of reconverge. So you think about chocolate, Chocolate, there are like lots of different types of chocolates early on. It kind of converges to a dominant design around like Hershey's, which is, economically, an efficient response, but not necessarily a great tasting experience. In other words, it's cheap. It brings chocolate to everybody. But now we see this reemergence of all these old chocolate factories with using old technology and, kind of a new era of ferment. And so I guess when I hear you talk about these theories, I kind of wonder what's kind of the overlap there. And the way we talk about what takes hold, by the way, is this idea of a window of opportunity before the dominant design. That the optimal time for an established firm to jump in is not too early, not too late, and it's right before the dominant design starts to get established. IBM did this, by the way, in the personal computer industry. They saw zillions, a whole bunch of, Apple was selling a whole bunch of personal computers, and it looked like it was taking off, and they literally performed a miracle, pulled together a personal computer in a year, and it defined the new dominant design. So this issue of fad or not, now I have to think about that one. That's challenging, and I might say, just off the cuff, is this something that, could we apply the disruptive technology lens to this? Like, when I teach my students about how do you recognize a disruptive technology, I usually tell them three things. One, can this do the same job for the customer that the previous technology did? Two, what are the resources it's going to take? So does it take new resources? And three, is it early in the life or late in the life? And I use the Netflix versus Blockbuster, right? When Netflix started out, it was not disruptive to Blockbuster. They rented DVDs when nobody even had DVD players. And then over time, they converged, and Netflix could do the same job that Blockbuster did, have a movie waiting for you on movie night. It could do it at a radically different way, because you didn't have all those physical storefronts, and you didn't have to sell through new copies of videos. So they had like a 5x inventory advantage over Blockbuster, and at that point, Blockbuster couldn't respond because they had all these old resources they couldn't get rid of. Let me think about that. How do you tell if it's a fad or not? But I don't know.
Well, just as a quick aside, I know there are other questions, but like in Disneyland, they finally had to reinvent Tomorrowland, sort of a Jules Verne version of Tomorrow, because all the attempts at anticipating the future became obsolete so fast.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Although
By the way, if it's about 4, if you have to leave, feel free. We have questions left for
And
Nathan.
leave me your card, by the way. Oh, yes, sorry, I owed you.
So, in talking about these disruptive technologies, it seems like a really good current example would be the example of the 16-year-old or however old he was boy who just invented an early detection test for pancreatic cancer with, that's like 1/200th of the cost of the technology that exists today. But I was reading about it, and apparently it's going to take 10 years before it's available.
Yeah.
And I also noticed that on one of your slides, it seemed to be that you were saying that the size of the corporation doesn't matter. But if you're talking about trying to manage uncertainty, wouldn't smaller always have to be better? In linguistic evolution, for example, or in the evolution of objects, so in industrial objects for everyday use, one trend that we've noticed is that the first object is always bigger and clunkier. Think of the very first portable telephones.
Yeah.
And then subsequent things tend to be much smaller. Well, language evolves interestingly similarly. When grammars first evolved, they're bigger and clunkier and more cumbersome, and then things gradually get streamlined. So wouldn't smaller always have to be better? And it seems to me that the problem with this new invention, this early detection test, is that there's such a massive infrastructure that that there's it's just bogglingly complex, and it's going to take way too long. The other question I had is, if you're trying to figure out how to manage uncertainty, the example of Sloan versus Durant, it seems to me that you've got the adventure capitalist in Durant versus the disciplined, Weberian capitalist in Sloan. It seems to me that you need to make room for the adventure capitalist and the unique individual, and the individual creative spark that cannot be predicted or generated in many cases artificially. And so if you had, smaller, seems to me to be more conducive to letting an individual sort of adventure capitalist have free reign and maximum creative agency, like that 16-year-old guy. He had maximum freedom because he wasn't working for anybody. He had open resources, and he finally found one person who allowed him to use the lab. But he didn't have a huge infrastructure. He had no major grants or anything like that.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of, great points. And I just say there's a lot of factors at play here. One factor at play in your example is that there's been a radical decrease in the barriers to innovation in all fields. Life sciences, web, physical products, things like 3D prototyping, Amazon Web Services, and simulation models of biology. I kind of went in reverse order back there. All apply to those fields and have decreased the barriers to innovation such that people can, we're seeing more innovation than ever before, more people doing it. That's one reason why I argue that uncertainty has increased. Now, it used to be the conventional wisdom was only that small companies could do this because they weren't inhibited by their existing kind of execution-oriented practices. It's not clear, though, that that has to be the case. So, for example, I was out talking to the founder of Intuit. So if you use TurboTax or Quicken or anything like that, or know somebody who does, one of the biggest personal financial software companies in the world, he said, we're trying to turn this into an 8,000 person startup, into a network of startups. And they use that language because they don't know what else to call it. Like they just say, I know that startups do something I want to do, which is they make room for the creative spark. They organize differently. They don't have these big bureaucratic teams. They don't have 10-month planning processes or 3-year horizons. They just say, you know what, let's do something now. And so what they're doing is things like saying we only want what we call 2 pizza teams, like no team bigger than what you can feed with 2 pizzas. We want to break down the legal barriers so they can go talk to customers immediately. Let's train them how to do it. And so I think the grand experiment we're making, at least in the past, the logic was startups do something different corporations can't do. And what I'm trying to say is it's not about the corporation per se, it's about the way you manage it. And to be honest with you, the way we taught entrepreneurship used to stink. And we teach students to write business plans. And then they would fail like crazy. And of course, all innovation, there's a lot of failure. But I would argue the reason why they failed, in part, is because it's the wrong technique. Business planning comes from strategic planning, which is what we do in big corporations to plan out the horizon. Planning when you're under uncertainty just wastes time. Because you're just making guesses and you're just making yourself more convinced that your guesses are right. When really what you need to do, and this goes back to the Austrian economists, is you have to actually get out in the market and experience it. And so I don't know deeply what you do, but it would be maybe analogous to me saying I'm going to do anthropology by never actually going and looking at devices or never actually going and looking at how people talk and what the language is. You have to actually get your hands dirty to understand what the uncertainty is. And that's when I talk about the disrupted university, I say, maybe online can't do what we do. But we probably don't know unless we start playing around with it. And to me, I kind of see it as a no-lose proposition because I say either we'll borrow something that will, we might be able to, so a guy I admire, he said, an experiment has option value, strategic value, and exit value. And I'm realizing those terms are very businessy, sorry. But what option value means is if the future happens, we already know how to play the game a little bit. Strategic value is, you know what, maybe if this is a total waste, we'll get to know people and meet people that can help us in other ways. And exit value is, well, maybe if the future doesn't happen the way we thought, we develop a piece of something that we could reuse. And so I see like Stanford, my old group is developing all these massively online open courseware. And I'm like, part of me is like, what a waste of time. I don't want to do that. But on the other hand, they're learning a lot of things. And even if a disrupted university future doesn't happen, at a minimum, my colleague has offloaded a lot of his teaching onto online and now spends his time in class like mentoring students. And I don't know. I don't claim to know what that future is. I just know that at the heart of it, managing uncertainty to me is about the speed of learning. That's what it's about because you have to, whereas management of certainty is around optimization and execution and avoiding errors. So I hope that, I believe that big companies can do this. I think there are examples of them doing this, but it is easier to do when you're unencumbered by the large organization. Yeah. Sorry.
Well, just a quick related question to Janice's, because it sounds like what you're describing is less about structural issues like size and more about culture. So there's such a thing as a culture of incumbency versus an entrepreneurial culture. But it does, I think it's fascinating to think about, as a university, there's a certain kind of institutional culture that applies to almost every university. What would it mean to try to foster an entrepreneurial ethic, in the College of Humanities? Is there something about universities that automatically reinforce an incumbency culture?
Oh, yeah.
And how would you think about challenging that?
Think about the business school. So when I was interviewing Scott Cook, so he's the founder of this company. I mean, these guys have like, X billion dollars in revenue, global company. And he says to me, we have to fundamentally retrain our MBAs when they get here. I'm like, whoa, you're saying something. And he says, the way we were all taught in Harvard Business School, for example, which we have this case-based method, so I give you a little write-up of a company that's got some data in the back, and you do an analysis and tell me what the right answer is. So that's totally wrong. Like that teaches let me sit back, let me look at the data, and let me conclude what the answer is. And he's saying, what we're teaching people to say is, instead, what questions should I be asking? And how would I design a rapid experiment to get that, to answer that question? And I do think that since we've entered school, and at least the way most educational systems are developed, we sit and we are told information and we practice that information. And I'm not sure that, my wife and I, we got kids, and, we don't do, please don't be offended, we don't do after-school soccer. And, I love soccer. I love soccer. And we don't do basketball, and we don't, we didn't put them in preschools that taught them to read early. And, I don't, worry that much about them mastering this subject or that. I mean, we've taken them out of school for 3 months at a time to go to France. Why? Because I kind of believe that the really most valuable skill is going to be able to think differently about hard problems. And where does that come from? It comes from, we've done a little bit of research on this, but at the end of the day, stuffing your brain full of novelty and then allowing yourself to ask all the questions and then explore and experiment, I could be totally wrong. My kids are like serving hot dogs at J-Dogs when they're, 55, then you can tell me that I was wrong, but I don't know. I mean, yeah, thank you. Yeah, but I have to say, I was so, even little things, like so in our neighborhood, so our kids, Tuller went to Walden Elementary here, and oh my gosh, what an unpopular decision that was in our neighborhood, because, they're going to go there and lose their testimonies and things like that, and it's all this, so much fear. And I was like, what? I want them to be challenged in the way they think. And my daughter came out of that after 2 years of that, and she was reading Grapes of Wrath, Great Gatsby, not assigned, like on her own in the summer. And we were sitting on the street, we were in France at the time. And she was talking to me about what was that all about? What did that mean? I'm sorry, she's in a high school class at a regular standard public high school here. And she is losing her love and enthusiasm of that. And that kind of thing concerns me. So in my innovation class, I'm just trying to get students to, what I'm trying to get them to do is think more questions, have more experiences, and move like 10 times faster in figuring out if there's anything there. And just kind of break down the paradigm. Oh, you had an idea for a new product? Return to me on Monday. It's Friday. On Monday, have a prototype. Find a way to do it. And I have crazy stories of people, doing crazy things. IBM, when they wanted to figure out if anybody cared about speech to text, they did a great thing. They could have spent 50 years developing that software. What did they do? They put up a curtain, and they had Ed on one side of the curtain and me on the other side, and Ed would say, what about that? And I'd type in, what about that? And it'd appear on the screen, and Ed thought it was doing voice recognition. And what they found out from that experiment is, wow, people love this if we could figure it out.
Yeah.
One thing about culture and innovation is I talked about that. I have to apologize, I'm not at all business oriented, so some of the language and phrasing may come out a little funny.
I have an English background.
But one thing that occurs to me that we haven't really talked about is that big companies have the edge in that they have larger resources.
Yeah.
I mean, it's sort of the old time or money. You either have time or you have money.
Yeah.
You rarely have lots and lots of both. It's kind of an issue that, if you're working on your own, if you're in a small group, it seems to me that very frequently these people have fewer resources.
Yeah.
They have a lot of initiative, they have a lot of vision, but you have to match that up with resources in order to make it happen, and a certain amount of security. I mean, there are countries and places, and history teaches us there are plenty of people with power that can and do clamp down on new technologies as well as other things when they interfere with their particular perusal of power.
Yeah.
So it just you know, it seems to me that there's a couple of different things I want to say here, but how do you deal with that? You know, how can you perhaps find a way to encourage big businesses to create that kind of culture within themselves and make that system work for them, that they have the resources and presumably the protection that they need to help develop things, and yet not have that work against?
Yeah. You know, one of the other books I'd love to write is just about paradox in business, because, you know, resources are a wonderful asset and they're a terrible hindrance sometimes. And I think that large businesses are So in this book, we try to argue that uncertainty along many measures has increased over the last 30, 40 years. And what we hear is companies saying, the number one thing we need is innovation. The number one thing is we need people who can think more broadly. And right now, it's a little bit of speaking out of two sides of their mouth, because sometimes they'll come to BYU and they'll want to hire somebody who has a really deep, specific skill set, kind of like the worker bee in the factory, so to speak. But then they kind of really want, on the other side, somebody who could think about things really differently. So my belief is they already see this. So surveys of CEOs and things, you know, the number one thing they want is innovative people, and they're you know, we see the turnover, for example, in companies just going through the roof, so firms dying more quickly, losing their advantage more quickly. So they're recognizing this, and they're wrestling with, how do we do this? What do we do? And I think it may be a tad early in the technology transition to be training students who are purely capable of this kind of more creative, innovative thinking, but I'm not sure it really is. It may be time. It may be the window of opportunity now. And it's part of a function of when they come in versus when they don't. But people are wanting people to think differently. And how do we, you know, culture, by the way, is something we talk about, but I don't feel like we do a very good job of it in business. We have tend to approach these things with pretty narrow lenses, you know, so. Institutional theory, for example, is a major theory in the field, and it comes from looking at the evolution of education. And it basically argues that in the history of any industry or organization or association, humans like us make a rule, like, for example, there should be no new square footage and employees or headcount at a university, say like ours. And yeah, and for example, and then, you know, and that was made in a particular historical context, like maybe things were going out of crazy, and it made sense then. But then over time, that gets institutionalized. It takes on like a sacredness of its own, so to speak, and you can't question it or challenge it anymore. And this happens in, you know, public schools. It happens in universities. It happens in corporations. It happens in industries, where we kind of set the rules of what something should look like, and then how do you challenge that is a big question, you know. And one of the ways you challenge it is to say, well, where did this rule come from? Why did it make sense then and doesn't make sense now? But we know that's a dangerous practice. So I would definitely never consider challenging rules like that, you know, by pointing out their historical origins or drawing direct analogies.
What do you think about anarchy in this process?
Well, anarchy, so like letting things, like, well, how would you define anarchy?
I don't know, I just, as an absence of rules.
Yeah.
I don't know if there is such a thing.
Well, I can tell you this. So one reason why we borrowed complexity theory into business, complexity theory, a best example is, you know, you look at biology, and you look at, for example, the deep ocean, and you have a lava heat vent, and there's a region of freezing cold where not much lives, and there's a region of super hot where not much lives, and then there's like a zone between the two, which is all these crazy life forms take off in there. And complexity theory brings in this idea that, you know, complete chaos, of course, is nothing, but too much structure is bad too, and so it's this zone in between. Sometimes they call it a dissipative equilibrium. So like if you think about like a hill, and like how do you keep the ball at the top and keep it from rolling? It requires energy to keep it there, but that's the most innovative space. And so some of the earlier work I did was on this idea of simple rules as a way to manage an organization rather than a fixed strategy. Say, it's about developing these heuristics that provide some structure and some flexibility. And that, you know, the structure helps you learn because you're not just shooting from the hip, like doing random things all the time. the heuristic also provides flexibility to adapt. So I think anarchy, I think the truth is somewhere in the middle, usually. And of course, it's always dependent on what's your problem. If you face a problem of relative certainty or high stability, it's a totally different set of theories than high uncertainty. So I'm not saying management theory is wrong. I think it's absolutely right for the right circumstances. But I just think our theory of uncertainty is anemic.
Calvin ball.
Yeah.
So that's the area between
Yeah.
uncertainty.
Yeah. 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 Good.
We've gone over time, but
Yeah, I'm
you've been
sorry.
You've been so good to stay, and thank you for asking the questions and for being here today. That's great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.